If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2 of this video series, links should be appearing on screen momentarily. I'd suggest watching both. The first explores the scope and the methodology I'll be utilizing, and the second presents an overview of the development of the Shinra Electric Power Company within the world of Final Fantasy VII, up to when the main narrative of the game begins. With this in mind, welcome back, comrades, for those who are here for Part 3. Part 1. The Shinra Manufacturing Department in Administrative Research. One of the aspects of late capitalism I touched on in the last video was the idea that in a globalized economy, full-scale war was bad for business. The neoliberal order, having established a far more interconnected and globalized economy, requires a certain degree of geopolitical stability to maintain the supply chain. This meant that overt military conflicts were mostly a thing of the past. Yet, this did not necessitate a decrease in either military spending or development. Rather, the military industry would refocus a considerable amount of its resources into local and state police forces, for the peace and protection of the citizenry, naturally. While the threat of some external enemy would continue to be used to justify the maintenance and expansion of military resources, these resources could also be utilized in a domestic context. Domestic, homegrown organizations which sought to undermine the authority of the state would be met with brutal suppression, but not always through overt military or police action. The first time the player is introduced to the Shinra Manufacturing Department in Administrative Research, also known as the Turks, it is shortly after being introduced to Aerith, where you intervene in their attempt to abduct her. The second time the player meets with the Turks is moments after one of their members, Reno, enters a self-destruct command on the main pillar in Sector 7. The player is then introduced to the leader of the Turks, Seng, in the midst of his abduction of Aerith. As it turns out, Aerith had spent the majority of her life under the surveillance of the Turks. Being the last person alive who possessed the blood of the Cetra, Aerith was essentially treated as a long-term investment. After all these years, Aerith is finally abducted by the Turks while rescuing Marlene from the destruction of Sector 7, for reasons I will be going into later on. Shinra, President Shinra himself, makes the executive order to drop the Sector 7 plate onto the Sector 7 slums, in order to wipe out Avalanche. Presumably, hundreds, if not thousands of citizens of Midgar are murdered in the process. The residents of the slum are utterly wiped out, but the casualties to those who reside on the upper plate, presumably based on how Midgar is designed and assuming a significantly higher population density, would have also suffered near total fatalities from such a drop. Capitalists absolutely despise the poor and the marginalized, but have absolutely no qualms about exploiting the so-called middle class if they deem it necessary. It's a sacrifice they are willing to make, and they have plenty of button men to do the dirty work for them. The Turks are very apt parallels of the real-world organizations which act as the covert and espionage branches of state military and law enforcement. The importance of this arm of capitalist control cannot be overstated, particularly as it relates to imperialist meddling in the global south, primarily through the rigging of elections, coups, or assassination of popularly elected left-wing leaders, and the installation of right-wing dictators sympathetic to the goals of global capital. These efforts are to ensure that access to cheap labor and resources remain to make the outsourcing of manufacturing economically feasible. As discussed in detail in Part 2 of the video series, the covert elements of imperialism become ever more important when overt global warfare is no longer a desirable means of asserting control. This is doubly so for the world of Final Fantasy VII. Of the primary antagonists the player encounters outside of the executive members of the Shinra Corporation, it is the Turks who you encounter in combat more than anyone else. You are able to fight members of the Turks, individually or as a group, a total of 5 times, each time as a boss encounter, and each time they slink away to harass you another day. It is also significant that almost every encounter with them results in a boss fight. Mechanically, this says something. Consider for a moment the debriefing following the successful bombing of Mako Reactor No. 1, when the issue of whether Avalanche had encountered anyone from Soldier is brought up by Barrett. Cloud indignantly taunts that if they had, they would have been killed. Yet, during the game, 3rd, 2nd, and even 1st class soldiers are only encountered as random encounters, never as bosses, and they are not particularly threatening encounters at that. If we explore the mechanics of the game a bit further, when you fight the Turks, especially during the latter parts of the game, you can also steal some unique and decent equipment from them. Compared to what each class of soldier has to steal, the offerings from the Turks are far superior. Shinra has effectively provided them with better equipment than their own elite military branch. This then reinforces the pattern I discussed in the previous video of refocusing military efforts from overt warfare to covert actions. Cloud remembers a military past which is no longer viable. In the present, the Turks are a far more effective opposition than Soldier. It is true that the relationship you build with the Turks becomes muddled and, depending on the player's style, can range from tacit hostility to begrudging respect. During the optional Wutai side quest, you all but team up with the Turks to rescue Yuffie. This is all by design. The game developers don't want to have simple, cartoonish antagonists, but rounded, three-dimensional opponents who have personalities and lives outside of merely getting in the player's way. Nevertheless, their functionality, what they do within the game is, despite their coolness, precisely the sort of counterintelligence capitalist states utilize to stymie, suppress, and destroy any opposition. Oh, and if you're wondering about how I spent the last few minutes prattling on about espionage in service of capitalism, about undermining any effort to organize and resist without mentioning Ket Shi, don't worry. We will get to Ket Shi. Sorry. Speaking of subterfuge, lies, and deception. Part 2. Shinra controls the papers. The first time the player comes across the Shinra Information Network, the media branch of Shinra Incorporated, is when you arrive back at the 7th Heaventh Bar for the debriefing following the first successful bombing mission. The TV in the background has an announcement from President Shinra. If the player explores Sector 7 a little more, they will come across a building with a weapons seller who mentions that while on the surface Avalanche claims to just be an anti-Shinra group, their real goal is to kill as many people as possible. In the Sector 5 slums, there is a man who lives in a house. When you speak with him for the first time, he states that everything President Shinra says is a lie, but that he doesn't trust Avalanche either. Later on, once Sector 7 has fallen, his tune has changed. He believes the fabricated story about Avalanche being the cause of the pillar's collapse. Interestingly, he also has a television which will display a variety of messages depending upon when in the game the player comes across it. One of the notable broadcasts states that while Avalanche destroyed Sector 7, there were no civilian casualties as Shinra was able to evacuate everyone to safety. The reality, as we know, is quite different. The other really choice broadcast occurs between Aerith's abduction and the raid on Shinra Tower. Citizens unite. Come to the light. Mako energy. Power is truth. Shinra is the future. Your real happiness can be found in obeying the company. It doesn't get more clear-cut than that. In their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of Mass Media, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky explore the impact corporatized media had upon the way that news was reported and conveyed to the general public. Their analysis is astute, and while they do not develop the phrase manufactured consent, their work certainly popularized the term. The study underlines how detrimental to ideas like accuracy and truth the current capitalist state is to journalism. The argument at the most fundamental level it follows. Journalists have a financial incentive through the dictates of their editors, and them through the owners of the company, to present groups like advertisers, publishers, and their own parent companies in the best light possible. This is made necessary because of the funding models which media rely on, primarily through the selling of advertisement space. Thus, journalism under the auspices of a capitalist mode of production are fundamentally stymied into self-censorship and act more as propagandists for the existing structure, rather than their mythologized function as the fourth estate. When Cloud is relaying his experiences of the Nibelheim incident at Com, and fails to remember the outcome of his battle with Sephiroth, Tifa chimes in that officially Sephiroth was listed as being dead, but also mentions that since Shinra controls the newspapers, that information cannot be trusted. When the player arrives in Nibelheim later on in the game, much to the party's shock, the town has been completely rebuilt and, creepily, repopulated with completely new inhabitants. The player can interact with the townsfolk, and reactions range from placid denial to outright hostility about the incident. The entire incident, Sephiroth's rampage, the razing of the town, the events at the Nibelheim reactor, simply didn't happen. Shinra quite literally manufactured a wholly invented history to cover up their responsibility for the mass murder of the original inhabitants of Nibelheim. Similar representations and deceptions follow anywhere Shinra has relied on brutal suppression to enforce their agenda. The accidental explosion during the construction of the Coral Reactor, anti-Shinra terrorists operating out of and being supported by Corel. The resistance to Shinra accessing Fort Condor, terrorists who have occupied Shinra property and are targeting and killing Shinra troops. One of the key ways that media propagate a particular narrative of events is through the valorizing or diminishing of victims. Those victims who are meant to be sympathized with are talked about as innocents or freedom fighters. Those meant to be diminished are spoken of as culprits or terrorists. The narrative of Final Fantasy VII is not subtle about this, but these kinds of media behavioral patterns nevertheless have long been an established mechanism of controlling dissent and opposition in the real world. Just as Shinra controls information to support and reify its own image and interests to the general public, so too does capital dictate who and what receives representation and coverage, and how this information should then be interpreted to justify the continued mode of production. Part 3. The President of Shinra Inc. is dead. Capitalism, historically, has operated on the idea of unending economic expansion, infinite market growth. This model, as cycled through the 20th century, has generated more wealth than any other period in human history. The cycle, however, has not been one of relative stability and growth, but instead of boom and bust. Apologists for capitalism, those economists who tend to remain insulated from the effects of the system, euphemistically refer to this as the business cycle. Through the repetitive expansion and attraction of economies, each apex results in more wealth transferred vertically, and each nadir results in more wealth transferred vertically. That's the thing. Even when workers lose their homes because of predatory lending practices, lose their jobs because a company filed for bankruptcy, or outsourced their labor to cheaper markets, the capitalists still win, usually through the intervention of the state. As much as they have been successful at consolidating wealth, as much as the system has been designed for the benefit of the capitalist class, growth cannot be infinite when wealth itself is finite. Typically, historically, the state intervenes to stave off total collapse, but there will come a time when the bust is so bad, so catastrophic, that the system will not be able to recover. This is just looking at it from a purely market or economic perspective, There's also the social fallout to contend with of massive job losses and rampant unemployment of people driven to desperation to merely survive. When the narrative of Final Fantasy VII begins, Shinra has already reached the height of its power. That's the thing with capitalism. Hegemony isn't enough. There needs to be constant growth and expansion. So what happens when the growth isn't possible because the system has incorporated as much as it possibly can? Stagnation is the natural result, which is also when the decline sets in and things like recessions occur. Shinra, now having control of the world, has nowhere left to expand to. This period is when emphasis on finding efficiencies begins to take root. The number of mechanized opponents which the player encounters throughout the game are centralized around Shinra strongholds: the reactors, subway, Shinra Tower, and Junon. For example, most of the bosses the player encounters throughout the first part of the Midgar-based section of the narrative are robotic. Guard Scorpion, Airbuster, 100 Gunner, Heli Gunner, and Motorball respectively. Airbuster is the only boss that is remarked upon by any of the Shinra executives, the president as it happens. He calls it a techno-soldier, as well as mentioning its novelty. Shinra, as can be plainly observed, is in the process of mechanizing its military and security forces. This is a departure from the past, when mass conscription of the population and chemically enhanced elite soldiers were necessary to fight their war. As we will see, the size and scope of the human troops remain symbolically significant to the image Shinra wishes to project, but beneath the surface level, humans are being replaced by machines. In addition to this, with the avalanche-caused destruction of Mako Reactors 1 and 5, the deliberate destruction of Sector 7 by Shinra, and the recapture of Aerith, the decision is made to restart the Neo Midgar project. This project is built upon the legend of the Promised Land, which originated among the Cetra. The economic potential of finding a place on the planet where the Mako energy is so concentrated that it will literally jump out of the earth, requiring little effort to extract, entails the potential for even greater profits for even less investment than the current method requires. Here was the future of Shinra: find the Promised Land, build a new city, and watch the profits roll in. Here at last was the answer to the current crisis. President Shinra, however, does not live long enough to see his plan come to fruition. He is executed by Sephiroth. This wasn't supposed to happen. The capitalists are supposed to be able to live outside the system, or at least be so insulated from the material effects the system produces as to not be affected by it. Yet, here he was, the leader of Shinra Inc., dead, still sitting atop his seat of power. The system, capitalism, is far more fragile than its promoters make us believe, and when that system begins to fail, when those whose benefit the most are themselves finally put at risk, where then do they turn? Part 4. Rufus. The player is first introduced to Rufus Shinra seconds after you discover the corpse of President Shinra. Aerith's comments are by far the most prescient. Rufus doesn't want to rely on a happy facade, doesn't want the path of least resistance and minimal violence. He wants overt shows of brutal and effective force. President Shinra was the kind of man to casually dismiss what he considered an insignificant rebellion while letting one of his robot soldiers finish you off. And Rufus? Rufus wants to fight you himself. This is the fundamental difference, the meaningful distinction between the older, liberal style of capitalism and the one which arises after the collapse. The capitalism which was embodied by President Shinra had absolutely no difficulty with utilizing oppressive and overwhelming military force when directed at enemies, generally those who were not yet incorporated into the Shinra fold, so to speak. Wutai is the obvious example, but considered Corel II had only recently acquiesced to allowing the Maker reactor to be built before the town was massacred. Certainly, subversive elements within Shinra-controlled territories wouldn't have been tolerated, and the security apparatus would have been utilized to suppress it, but typically, once the population had been pacified, Shinra turned to softer means of maintaining control. This is why I make the case that during the first few hours of gameplay, the crisis for Shinra, for capitalism, is beginning to unfold. Events are set into motion which herald the end of the existing order, and preclude that a new age is coming. The destruction of Maker Reactors 1 and 5, and the defeat of Airbuster by a single group of rebels, frightens the president enough that he feels justified in destroying an eighth of his own city to wipe out the threat. Shinra itself will never be blamed, of course. How unimaginable to the citizenry would it be to think that Shinra would attack its own citizens? As we have seen, placing the blame on Avalanche was par for the course. Still, this is a loss for the president. To have had his cool exterior broken and to force his hand in such a fashion represents a break from the past. Rufus, we learn, doesn't want to do things like his father did, doesn't want to expend resources to placate the masses, not when fear can control them much more efficiently. Rufus wants to be seen as an active leader, one who is strong enough to help the system not only endure, but thrive in the state of crisis it has placed itself in. Later on, when the player arrives in Junon, the overt symbol of Shinra's military might, preparations are underway for what amounts to a coronation for Rufus. As the events unfold, the coronation is in fact a military parade which is being broadcast all over the world. Noticeably, the parade features blocks of Shinra troops, but little to no robotic forces are present. This is significant as it plays into the narrative of Shinra maintaining a more human face of a force gradually being automated. It is reassuring in a time of potential unease. While there is no indication that the manner of the death of President Shinra was made public, certainly one of the initial goals of a new regime is to assert that a smooth transition occurs and that the citizens can be assured of a stable continuity. Rufus is also more hands-on. Of all the times the player sees Rufus, only twice is he in Shinra Tower, the first and the last time. Otherwise, he is being proactive, leading from the front. He is also more brutal in his efforts of suppression, albeit, given the much shorter span of time he is given narratively, little is actually accomplished. He does continue his father's transition to more automated security measures, and institutes a state of martial law in Midgar following the destruction of a weapon at Junon. He also moves the Mako cannon in Midgar in order to point it at the greatest threat to Shinra, Sephiroth. Since Sephiroth is effectively sealed within the barrier over the northern crater, the most obvious reason for the lockdown of Midgar is you. By this point in the game, Avalanche has been a constant thorn in the side of Shinra, effectively opposing them at every encounter and stymieing their plans. President Shinra dismissed Avalanche as a nuisance and ignored them to his death. Rufus, having spent far more resources and manpower combating them, understands the very real threat they represent and will do all he can to prevent them from defying Shinra anymore. Of course, the real danger, the existential threat to Shinra, isn't really Avalanche at all, but the fear of their own citizens. The people of Midgar, one would assume, vastly outnumber the available security forces at Shinra's disposal, and given that an impending extinction event is literally getting closer with each passing day, the volatility of a frightened and angry citizenry is a threat worth considering. Thus, the state of martial law is both a show of force and stability. Shinra will protect you so long as the rules were followed. After all, there are terrorists about. Part 5. Someone, anyone to blame. After the events in the Northern Cave, after Meteor has been summoned and the weapons have been unleashed, the party is taken by Shinra to Junon. Tifa recovers from a coma to a very different world. Weapon is running rampant, and Meteor looms overhead, casting the world in an uncomfortable orange hue. Cloud is missing. Also, Barrett and Tifa, the only members of Avalanche who are not out looking for the now missing Cloud, are going to be publicly executed for causing Meteor to be summoned. When these inevitable crises occur in capitalist systems, it is not the capitalists, not the bosses, who will ever shoulder the blame or accept responsibility. There are systems, governmental, economic, and social, which exist specifically to shield capitalists from negative outcomes as much as possible. It is true that the boom and bust cycle I discussed above can see individual losers, so to speak. Businesses get shuttered all the time after all, so the system does not function perfectly. That the system itself survives, despite not being particularly efficient or even particularly effective, is what the support systems which are built in do. Following the bursting of the Japanese economic miracle bubble in 1989, Japan experienced a solid decade of decline and then another of stagnation and very slow growth. This, as I mentioned in part 1 of this video series, is commonly referred to as the lost decade, or score. Workers, as always, suffered the most deleterious effects of the economic collapse. Real wages stagnated over a 20-year period and have yet to reach the pre-burst levels. Efforts of reform, following the neoliberal dogma of the era, was mass privatization, and temporary employment levels jumped from 15% to 35%. Productivity was maintained and even increased via paying workers less for the same or even more productivity. When crisis emerges, it is the workers who are made to suffer. The executions are to be televised, and Scarlett, the executive in charge of weapons development and manufacturing, is overseeing the proceedings. There is no trial, no judiciary process to determine guilt or innocence. Just Shinra broadcasting that Avalanche is responsible for Meteor and placing the blame solely on them. When asked why a televised public execution is being carried out, she answers, Shinra, through the existing media system, can convince even the population, who we know are skeptical of them, into believing the narrative because the alternative is too difficult to accept. Consider this from the perspective of the citizenry. The idea that Shinra is not only unable to protect the citizenry, but is actually responsible for the current crisis, sounds like the kind of conspiratorial rantings of cranks or terrorists. This all ties back into the idea of manufactured consent I discussed in part 2. This is just watching it play out in a more brutal fashion under the new regime. In response, Shinra launches a threefold charm offensive: punish the guilty party, combat the rampaging weapon, and create a plan to destroy the imminent threat of Meteor. Shinra utilizes their media apparatus to create spectacle to sell the narrative that they can save the world. In doing so, they placate the citizenry to distract them from who the real villains are. Part 6. Reunion. You may have noticed that, so far, I have not really talked about the individual who most would argue is the true antagonist of Final Fantasy VII, Sephiroth. I'd also be among that number. The narrative of the game is very clear about the existential threat which Sephiroth represents to the continued existence of all life on the planet. The entire final dungeon, the North Cave, and 4 final boss battles all revolve around Sephiroth in one form or another. The framing of the primary character motivations of at least 2 party members, Cloud and Tifa, are similarly focused on revenge against him for the murder of their families and destruction of their hometown. Cloud spends 2/3 of the game being manipulated by Sephiroth, and so it is incredibly clear that Sephiroth, both mechanically and narratively, is the big bad. Who, though, is responsible for Sephiroth? Shinra. It's Shinra. The discovery and freeing of Genova while surveying for potential sites for a Mako reactor was Shinra. The Genova project, the attempt to create an artificial Cetra to enable the discovery of the Promised Land, was Shinra. Shinra created Sephiroth. Shinra trained Sephiroth. Shinra used his incredible combat proficiency to crush the last opposing political force to secure its place at the apex of the planet. Shinra hid the truth from Sephiroth and murdered Dr. Gast, perhaps the only person who could have reasoned with him. Thus, when Sephiroth discovers his true origins and suffered a psychotic break resulting in mass death and destruction, Shinra was uniquely responsible. After what Shinra would secretly name the Nibelheim incident, given the entire thing was covered up as if it never happened, the second phase of the Genova project was covertly undertaken by the scientist Hojo. The project was based upon a hypothesis that the individual cells of Genova would eventually begin to reform themselves to the host, the original Genova. This time, instead of trying to create an organism with the abilities of the Cetra, the goal was to create clones of Sephiroth, with the express goal of locating his body. Cloud, a recently recovered victim of the Nibelheim incident, was used in the experiment to create what was deemed an unsuccessful clone of Sephiroth. Through the implantation of Genova cells, advanced Mako poisoning, and the manipulation of his memories, Cloud was the only successful clone. The experiment was a success, but in the process, Cloud is manipulated into giving the black materia to Sephiroth, allowing him to summon Meteor, setting the stage for the endgame in the process. Did Shinra set out to create Sephiroth in order to destroy the planet? Of course not. They never even dreamed that the Genova project would go so far off the rails. Their goal was, as always, to continue to expand their control over the world and increase their profits. That's just it though. Their intentions don't really count for much in the face of the consequences of their actions. Regardless of what Shinra intended to do, the reality was that Sephiroth executed the president, murdered Aerith, summoned Meteor, and was waiting to absorb the collective life energy of all life on the planet. The real crisis for the planet was here, and it was entirely the fault of Shinra. Of course, even without the existential crisis Sephiroth can be understood to be a metaphor of, Shinra was still killing the planet through the process of Mako production. We know this because when the player visits Cosmo Canyon and meets Bugenhagen for the first time, he laments that the planet is dying, and then to hammer the point home, you get to hear the literal screams of the planet. As I've already mentioned, the study of planet life is established science, so Shinra knows that it is killing the planet. They just don't care. Narratively, the player has to defeat Shinra before they can move on to defeat Sephiroth. The system which created the current crisis must be brought to an end before that crisis can be effectively dealt with. Part 7. Shinra is finished. Shinra has a plan. Collect a particular kind of materia which develops in reactors from years of Mako production. Huge materia. Load it onto Shinra number 26 and use the rocket as a missile to destroy Meteor before it can destroy the planet. And while the player is tasked with retrieving the huge materia and preventing its destruction, regardless of the outcome, the missile fails to destroy Meteor. Shinra has another plan. Utilizing the brightest minds and the most bleeding-edge technology money can buy, they will develop weapons to equip their most elite troops to invade the northern crater and stop Sephiroth. Then they load it onto a plane which gets shot down by a weapon. This is not a crisis Shinra can stop. Their efforts are fruitless. A last desperate attempt to salvage its position as global hegemon and prevent what is coming. But they simply cannot. The center cannot hold. Things come to an end very rapidly for Shinra. Rufus is able to fire off a round from the recently improved Sister Ray incidentally destroying both Diamond Weapon and the barrier surrounding the northern cave. He stands triumphant momentarily until a bombardment fired off by Diamond Weapon destroys the upper floors of Shinra Tower, seemingly killing Rufus. Reeve, the head of urban development and planning, then notices that the Sister Ray, the recently renamed Mako Cannon, is charging up to fire again. This is bad, because it will overload the Mako reactors and cause a massive explosion which could wipe out Midgar. It turns out Hojo, the completely amoral scientist who Shinra has given free rein to his entire career, is acting entirely within character and doesn't care if the explosion destroys Midgar. Reeve, who values Midgar above everything else, asks the only other two Shinra executives who are still around, Heidegger and Scarlet, to not get in Avalanche's way when they come to try to stop Hojo. They refuse. This is it then. This is the summation of how the system which supports capitalism functions in Crisis. This is, historically, how its agents react when unable or unwilling to counteract a looming disaster of their own making, are then presented with an alternative organizational structure, one which does not include them, and flatly rejects it. Possessed of their own self-assurance, deluding themselves that only they have the ability to solve the problem at hand, they will actively obstruct any attempts to resolve this issue independent of them. Shinra doesn't use its security forces to stop Hojo. It has them attack Avalanche. The Turks aren't dispatched to disable Sister Ray or take Hojo out. They are ordered to kill Avalanche on sight. Heidegger and Scarlet not only have the time to get to Sister Ray before the player does, but they have a giant mechanized robot, and they use it to fight Avalanche. When the player finally confronts Hojo and the revelation that he is actually Sephiroth's father is made known, the utter contempt for life which Shinra has made its guiding principle in its pursuit of wealth and power is made manifest. Shinra, then, at its core, at its most fundamental level, is a terrestrial Genova, not a crisis from the skies, but of the planet itself, and clearly, just as much of an existential threat to life being able to continue. The Shinra Electric Power Company, the deceased president, the presumably dead Rufus, the executives who are now in control, don't assume any responsibility for being the catalyst and cause of Genova, the weapons, Meteor, or Sephiroth. When the existing system which is responsible for all these crises are faced with the consequence of their actions and do nothing, or when they not only refuse to do anything, but actively exacerbate the problem, when they oppose alternatives, either passively or aggressively, then the question which needs answering is, what is to be done? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you think it is merited, please like and share. If you'd like to know when the next video is out, subscribe to the channel. The next video, Part 4, will be the final entry in the series, but it is also the part I've been the most excited to make, so things to look forward to. If you'd like to see what else I've made, there should be some links popping up. Thanks for your time.